At 2140, the East Corridor outside the Junior Royal Apartments should have been silent and empty. The Royal Guard on night rotation stopped when he noticed a thin line of light beneath a storage room door that was never listed on the patrol map. A small shoe lay beside the wall, far too small for staff. He checked the logbook. No entry. Inside the corridor, something shifted softly.
The corridor behind the service wing was rarely used at that hour. The lighting was dim but steady, casting long rectangular reflections across the polished stone floor. The Royal Guard moved through the passage with the measured pace expected of palace security, calm, deliberate, and quiet. His shift had begun like any other, a routine patrol of secondary corridors where nothing significant was expected to happen. Yet something about this section of the building felt subtly wrong. Not alarming, not obvious, but enough to pull his attention away from the predictable rhythm of the patrol. The storage corridor should have been silent, but he noticed a faint shift in the air, the kind of disturbance that happens when a door has been moved recently. It was a small detail, barely noticeable to anyone without long familiarity with the building's behavior. His eyes moved along the row of service doors used for equipment storage and maintenance supplies. Most stood closed but unlatched, exactly as protocol required. Only one door broke the pattern. The handle sat perfectly still, but the external latch had been turned into a locked position. That alone made him stop. Storage doors inside the royal residential wing were never locked from the outside. Palace safety policy was clear on this point. Internal rooms had to remain accessible in case of emergency. He stepped closer, boots silent against the stone. The guard reached the door and rested one gloved hand lightly against the metal handle. It did not move. The latch held it firmly in place. A locked service door in this section of the palace was not merely unusual, it was a direct violation of residential safety protocol. His posture shifted slightly, his attention sharpening. For several seconds he simply listened. The corridor remained still, the distant mechanical hum of ventilation the only sound. Then something else reached him, a soft movement, barely audible. A slight scuff from inside the room, followed by a small pause of silence that felt heavier than it should. The guard leaned closer to the doorframe. There was a narrow gap along the bottom, where a thin line of darkness showed against the corridor light. He lowered his head slightly, listening again. This time the sound came more clearly, a quiet movement, the shifting of weight, and something that resembled a small breath taken too quickly. The possibility formed in his mind immediately. Someone was inside the room, and whoever it was had been locked in from the outside. The guard straightened slowly, his calm demeanor unchanged, but his attention fully engaged now. His training did not allow hesitation in situations involving enclosed spaces. Without raising his voice, he tested the latch again, confirming the lock. Still sealed. The rule was simple. Any obstruction preventing access to an occupied room inside the royal residential wing required immediate intervention. He placed one hand firmly on the latch mechanism and applied pressure. The metal resisted at first, the locking pin refusing to release under the first attempt. The guard adjusted his grip and forced the mechanism with controlled strength. The latch snapped open with a sharp metallic click that echoed down the quiet corridor. The door shifted inward by several centimeters. From the darkness inside the room came the unmistakable sound of a small movement reacting to the sudden light entering the space. The guard opened the door wider, stepping just enough to see into the interior of the storage room. The light from the corridor spilled into the storage space in a narrow beam, illuminating stacked supply crates and folded maintenance equipment along the walls. The room itself remained mostly dark, the overhead switch apparently left off. For a moment, the guard saw nothing unusual. Then his eyes adjusted to the shadows. Near the far side of the room, partially behind a stack of folded storage containers, a small figure moved cautiously toward the light. The guard's posture changed immediately, not outwardly dramatic, but unmistakably alert. Even before the child stepped fully into view, he recognized the silhouette. Princess Charlotte stood inside the storage room, her small hands pressed lightly against the edge of a crate, as if steadying herself. Her expression was confused more than frightened, but the uncertainty in her eyes was unmistakable. The guard felt a cold tightening in his chest that had nothing to do with panic and everything to do with the seriousness of the situation. A child of the royal household had been locked alone in a dark service room inside a secured palace wing. That was not a minor mistake. He lowered his voice instinctively, keeping his tone calm and controlled. "Your Royal Highness," he said quietly, stepping into the room just enough to reduce the contrast between darkness and light. Charlotte looked toward him with visible relief, but did not rush forward. The guard immediately recognized the behavior. Children raised inside royal residences were accustomed to discipline and structure. She waited, unsure whether she was supposed to move. He crouched slightly to reduce the height difference, keeping his voice steady. "It's all right. You can come this way." The child moved carefully across the floor toward him, small shoes making soft sounds against the concrete. When she reached the doorway, the corridor light fully illuminated her face. There were no visible injuries, no signs of distress beyond confusion and the lingering tension of being alone in a dark place. The guard's mind processed details quickly. Clothing intact, posture steady, breathing normal. Still, the presence of the locked latch behind her carried enormous implications. He stepped aside to allow her into the corridor, positioning himself between the princess and the open doorway. Once she was clear of the room, he pulled a compact palace radio from his belt. His voice remained measured as he spoke into the command channel. "Control, this is Residential Patrol 3. I have located Princess Charlotte in Service Corridor B, Storage Room 14. The radio crackled softly as the command officer responded, the tone immediately sharpening. "Confirm externally locked?" The guard glanced once at the latch mechanism still hanging loose from where he had forced it open. Confirmed. Door was secured from the outside. A pause followed on the line, short but heavy with meaning. Even through the radio, he could feel the sudden shift in attention from the command center. The guard looked briefly down at Charlotte, who stood quietly beside him, watching the exchange without fully understanding its significance. His next actions were automatic. He stepped forward and closed the storage door, ensuring it remained unlocked this time. Then he positioned himself beside the princess, creating a protective barrier between her and the empty corridor behind them. "Control," he continued calmly, "request immediate security review of this corridor. Possible breach of internal safety protocol." The words were carefully chosen, but the meaning was unmistakable. Someone had locked that door, and someone inside the palace had violated one of the most basic rules of royal protection.
The royal guard did not rush, but his pace through the corridor was no longer the slow rhythm of routine patrol. Princess Charlotte walked beside him, small steps measured as she kept close to his left side. The corridor lights cast long pale reflections across the polished floor, and the silence of the service wing felt heavier now that the guard understood what had just occurred. His focus remained outwardly calm, but internally every detail of the environment was being examined. Doors, corners, shadows, ventilation sounds. Nothing in the corridor suggested immediate danger, yet the locked door behind them had already confirmed that protocol inside the palace had been broken. That alone meant the situation could not be treated as finished. Charlotte glanced once toward the guard as they moved, her voice quiet but steady. "I couldn't open the door." The guard inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the statement without encouraging further conversation. "You're safe now, Your Royal Highness," he replied calmly. His tone carried reassurance without unnecessary explanation. His duty in that moment was simple: move her safely back to the protected residential section while keeping the corridor secure. At the same time, the command channel in his ear had grown more active. The operations room had already shifted from routine monitoring to incident response. A second voice joined the radio traffic. "Residential Patrol 3, confirm status of the child." The guard responded without breaking stride. "Princess Charlotte is unharmed, escorting her back to the residential wing now." "Understood. Continue escort. Security Control is reviewing corridor camera logs." The mention of cameras pulled the guard's attention back toward the section of corridor they had just left. The palace relied heavily on overlapping camera coverage in service areas, precisely to prevent unnoticed movement. Every corridor, especially those near the residential wing, was continuously monitored. If the door had been locked deliberately, someone must have passed through that area beforehand, and that movement should already be visible in the system. They approached the transition point where the service corridor connected with the protected residential hallway. The lighting changed subtly there, warmer, softer, designed to create a more welcoming environment inside the living quarters. 2 additional guards stood at the security point, their posture immediately sharpening as they recognized the situation unfolding. The escorting guard gave a brief nod, princess returning to residence. The checkpoint guard stepped forward instantly, opening the secured passage door. Charlotte crossed the threshold first, entering the quiet residential corridor, where the atmosphere felt noticeably calmer. Only once she was safely beyond the checkpoint did the escorting guard pause. He pressed the radio button again. "Control, child is secure inside residential wing." The command officer answered immediately, acknowledged. Then came the next update. Initial system review shows a disruption in camera coverage along Service Corridor B. The guard's expression remained controlled, but his attention sharpened further. Clarify disruption. Camera B14 lost signal for 6 minutes. Feed interruption began approximately 4 minutes before your patrol entered the corridor. 6 minutes. Inside a palace security system, that number carried enormous weight. Cameras inside residential service areas did not fail randomly. Every system was backed by redundant monitoring and automatic alerts. A 6-minute gap meant something either malfunctioned at a very specific moment or someone had interfered with the system deliberately. The guard stood still in the quiet junction between the 2 corridors. 6 minutes was more than enough time for someone to enter the area, lock a door, and leave again before coverage resumed. And if the interruption was intentional, the individual responsible knew exactly where the blind spot would appear. Inside the command center, technicians were already isolating the corrupted footage, while security supervisors reviewed access logs. The escorting guard remained positioned near the corridor checkpoint, maintaining watch while additional personnel began moving toward the service area he had just cleared. The palace operated on a principle of quiet containment during internal incidents. There would be no alarms, no raised voices, only controlled movement and precise communication. The radio clicked again. "Residential Patrol 3, remain at your current position. Internal lockdown requested for Service Corridor B." The guard acknowledged the instruction with a brief response. "Understood." Moments later, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed faintly from deeper within the service section. 2 palace security officers appeared at the far end of the hallway, moving with the purposeful calm of trained investigators. Their arrival confirmed that the situation had already been elevated beyond a routine security review. The guard watched them pass through the checkpoint and disappear down the corridor toward the storage room where Charlotte had been found. The command channel remained active in his ear. Technical staff inside the monitoring room continued speaking quietly as they analyzed the system logs. Camera B14 feed restored automatically after 6 minutes. Another voice responded, "Check power supply fluctuations." A pause followed before the answer returned. "Power is stable. No external interruption detected." The implication was clear. The camera did not lose power. It had been disconnected or overridden. The guard rested one hand lightly against the belt of his ceremonial uniform. His posture remained composed despite the growing seriousness of the report. A system override inside the palace required internal access. Maintenance technicians possessed that level of clearance, but so did certain categories of staff working in restricted areas. If the feed had been intentionally disabled, someone with legitimate credentials had likely been involved. The command officer returned to the radio. "Residential Patrol 3, additional information incoming." The guard responded immediately. "Go ahead." Access logs show no scheduled staff activity in Service Corridor B during the time of the camera interruption. That detail removed the last remaining routine explanation. No maintenance work, no scheduled inspections, no authorized staff presence. Yet a child had been locked in a storage room during a 6-minute surveillance gap. The guard's eyes moved briefly down the quiet residential hallway where Charlotte had disappeared moments earlier. The stillness of the palace contrasted sharply with the tension building inside the security network monitoring it. The command officer spoke again, this time more carefully. "We are initiating a full internal security review. Corridor B will remain restricted until further notice." The guard understood what that meant. The palace was no longer dealing with a misplaced child or a careless mistake. Someone inside the building had interfered with surveillance systems and violated the safety rules protecting the royal residence. And until investigators determined who did it, the possibility remained that the individual responsible was still somewhere inside the palace walls.
The service corridor had grown busier in quiet, controlled ways. Investigators had arrived without drawing attention, their presence marked only by subtle changes in posture and the occasional murmur of low radio communication. The Royal Guard remained near the security checkpoint between the residential wing and Service Corridor B, exactly where command had instructed him to stay. From that position, he could see part of the corridor stretching toward the storage room where Princess Charlotte had been found. The area was now partially sealed, investigators examining the latch, the floor, and the surrounding door frames with methodical patience. Everything about the response followed palace protocol: evidence first, logs second, interviews afterward. Yet as the guard watched the activity, a small detail continued to trouble him. It was not something dramatic. In fact, it was the kind of detail most people would overlook entirely. The command center had already confirmed that the camera lost signal for exactly 6 minutes. That suggested deliberate interference, likely performed through an internal system panel or maintenance access. Investigators were now tracing that possibility through the palace network. But the guard's attention had settled on something else, something physical. When he had forced open the storage room door earlier, his focus had been on the child inside. Only afterward had he noticed a faint mark near the floor beside the doorframe. It was subtle, a narrow line in the thin layer of corridor dust where someone's shoe had pivoted sharply. The mark suggested hesitation, a quick turn before leaving the area. It implied that whoever locked the door had paused there for a moment before walking away. That pause mattered. People rarely linger in a corridor when they know cameras are active. The guard replayed the sequence in his mind while maintaining his outward composure.
camera interruption begins. Someone moves into the corridor. The storage door is locked. A child remains inside. Then the individual pauses near the door before leaving. Why pause? His gaze shifted slowly toward the far end of the corridor, where investigators had begun checking the maintenance panels along the wall. The answer formed quietly in his thoughts. Because the person may not have left immediately. They may have gone somewhere nearby. Something else had also been mentioned during the command center's initial review, an access card signal briefly detected within the corridor system. The report had been short and almost secondary to the camera failure, but the guard remembered hearing it. A staff access card had pinged the internal system within the same 6-minute window. No staff were scheduled in that area at the time. Normally, such a detail would be handled entirely by investigators and system analysts. A ceremonial guard's duty was patrol and protection, not internal digital tracking. His responsibility technically ended the moment he delivered Charlotte safely back to the residential wing. Yet the thought refused to leave his mind. If someone had locked the door and remained nearby, the threat might not have exited the palace yet. The guard kept his posture steady for several minutes longer, watching the investigators continue their careful examination of the corridor. Then another update came through the radio. Command to investigative team. Access card activity detected near the service corridor at 1842. Reviewing staff logs now. The guard's attention sharpened immediately. That timestamp matched almost perfectly with the beginning of the camera interruption. The investigators down the corridor paused briefly as the information reached them. One of them began speaking quietly into his own radio, likely coordinating with system technicians. But the guard understood something that the remote analysts could not immediately see. Access card signals were not always precise indicators of movement. A card might register at one point in the corridor, while the individual carrying it moved through another nearby door. The palace had multiple maintenance entrances hidden within service walls, doors that rarely appeared on standard patrol routes. And if someone knew those passages well enough, they could still be inside the building. For several seconds, the guard remained exactly where he had been ordered to stay. The instructions from command were clear. Maintain position at the residential checkpoint. Allow investigators to handle the incident. But palace protection training also emphasized something less formal, something older than the written procedures. When small irregularities appeared during a security incident, ignoring them could allow larger threats to develop unnoticed. His decision formed quietly, without drama. The guard reached to his radio and spoke in a steady voice. Control, this is Residential Patrol 3, requesting clarification on the access card signal location. The command officer answered after a brief pause. Signal registered near maintenance node B17. The guard immediately pictured the location. B17 was not inside the corridor investigators were currently examining. It sat behind a narrow service wall further down the hallway, connected to a secondary maintenance access door used mostly by electrical technicians. That door opened into a secondary passage rarely used during normal operations. And if someone knew those passages well enough, they could still be inside the building. For several seconds, the guard remained exactly where he had been ordered to stay. The instructions from command were clear. Maintain position at the residential checkpoint. Allow investigators to handle the incident. But palace protection training also emphasized something less formal, something older than the written procedures. When small irregularities appeared during a security incident, ignoring them could allow larger threats to develop unnoticed. His decision formed quietly, without drama. The guard reached to his radio and spoke in a steady voice. Control, this is Residential Patrol 3, requesting clarification on the access card signal location. The command officer answered after a brief pause. Signal registered near maintenance node B17. The guard immediately pictured the location. B17 was not inside the corridor investigators were currently examining. It sat behind a narrow service wall further down the hallway, connected to a secondary maintenance access door used mostly by electrical technicians. That door opened into a secondary passage rarely used during normal operations. And if someone knew those passages well enough, they could still be inside the building. For several seconds, the guard remained exactly where he had been ordered to stay. The instructions from command were clear. Maintain position at the residential checkpoint. Allow investigators to handle the incident. But palace protection training also emphasized something less formal, something older than the written procedures. When small irregularities appeared during a security incident, ignoring them could allow larger threats to develop unnoticed. His decision formed quietly, without drama. The guard reached to his radio and spoke in a steady voice. "Control, this is Residential Patrol 3, requesting clarification on the access card signal location." The command officer answered after a brief pause. "Signal registered near maintenance node B17. The guard immediately pictured the location. B17 was not inside the corridor investigators were currently examining. It sat behind a narrow service wall further down the hallway, connected to a secondary maintenance access door used mostly by electrical technicians. That door opened into a secondary passage rarely used during normal operations. And if someone knew those passages well enough, they could still be inside the building. For several seconds, the guard remained exactly where he had been ordered to stay. The instructions from command were clear. Maintain position at the residential checkpoint. Allow investigators to handle the incident. But palace protection training also emphasized something less formal, something older than the written procedures. When small irregularities appeared during a security incident, ignoring them could allow larger threats to develop unnoticed. His decision formed quietly, without drama. The guard reached to his radio and spoke in a steady voice. "Control, this is Residential Patrol 3, requesting clarification on the access card signal location." The command officer answered after a brief pause. "Signal registered near maintenance node B17. The guard immediately pictured the location. B17 was not inside the corridor investigators were currently examining. It sat behind a narrow service wall further down the hallway, connected to a secondary maintenance access door used mostly by electrical technicians. That door opened into a secondary passage rarely used during normal operations. And if someone knew those passages well enough, they could still be inside the building. For several seconds, the guard remained exactly where he had been ordered to stay. The instructions from command were clear. Maintain position at the residential checkpoint. Allow investigators to handle the incident. But palace protection training also emphasized something less formal, something older than the written procedures. When small irregularities appeared during a security incident, ignoring them could allow larger threats to develop unnoticed. His decision formed quietly, without drama. The guard reached to his radio and spoke in a steady voice. "Control, this is Residential Patrol 3, requesting clarification on the access card signal location." The command officer answered after a brief pause. "Signal registered near maintenance node B17. The guard immediately pictured the location. B17 was not inside the corridor investigators were currently examining. It sat behind a narrow service wall further down the hallway, connected to a secondary passage rarely used during normal operations. If someone had moved through it during the camera outage, they could have bypassed the main corridor entirely. The guard spoke again, carefully choosing his words. "Control, confirm whether maintenance door B17 has been checked." A longer pause followed this time. Negative. Investigative team is currently focused on the storage corridor. The guard looked down the hallway where the investigators continued working methodically near the storage door. They were thorough, but their attention remained centered on the immediate scene. B-17 sat nearly 20 meters further down the corridor. If someone had passed through that maintenance door during the 6-minute camera outage, the investigators would not see the evidence from where they stood. The guard understood the implications of what he was about to do. Ceremonial guards did not normally leave assigned positions during an ongoing investigation without direct authorization. The checkpoint protecting the residential wing existed for a reason. Leaving it, even briefly, could lead to formal disciplinary review. But if someone had entered that maintenance passage, and if that person was still moving through the palace infrastructure, the threat might not be over yet. The guard pressed the radio again, this time more simply. "Control, I'm moving to visually check maintenance door B-17. The command officer responded quickly. "Residential Patrol 3, hold your position. Investigators will handle..." But by that moment, the guard had already stepped away from the checkpoint. His movement remained calm and controlled, not rushed, not reckless. The corridor ahead stretched quietly under the steady lights, the distant investigators still focused on the storage door. The guard moved past them without interrupting their work, continuing toward the far end of the hallway where the maintenance wall met the corner junction. The door labeled B-17 stood partially recessed into the wall paneling, a narrow gray access point that most people walking the corridor would never notice. The guard stopped in front of it and examined the handle. The first thing he noticed was the position of the latch. It was not fully closed, just slightly misaligned, as if the door had been pulled shut quickly, but not properly secured. The guard rested one gloved hand against the metal surface. The door felt faintly warm under his palm, warmer than the surrounding wall, a sign of recent use. His attention sharpened immediately. Someone had passed through this door not long ago, and if the timing matched the camera outage, the person responsible for locking the storage room might have used this passage to move deeper into the palace infrastructure. The guard slowly turned the handle. The maintenance door opened into a narrow service passage beyond, dimly lit by a single overhead utility light. The corridor stretched forward into the building's hidden operational space, quiet, empty at first glance. But the guard knew now that the investigation had missed something important, and stepping through that doorway meant he had officially moved beyond his assigned authority. The private briefing room inside the residential wing was deliberately quiet. Thick curtains softened the evening light coming through the tall windows, and the long table at the center of the room remained mostly empty except for a few folders placed neatly near one end. The atmosphere carried the controlled stillness typical of palace security meetings, where urgency was never expressed through raised voices, but through precision and restraint. Prince William stood near the window when the security officers entered. His posture was straight, one hand resting lightly against the back of a chair as he turned toward them. The senior protection officer spoke first, his tone respectful but direct. "Your Royal Highness, thank you for meeting us on short notice." William nodded once, signaling for the briefing to begin. He had already been told that a minor security matter had occurred inside the palace, but the lack of immediate detail had left a quiet tension in the room. The officer opened the folder and began with the basic sequence. Approximately 40 minutes ago, a patrol guard discovered Princess Charlotte inside a storage room located in Service Corridor B. William's expression changed almost instantly. The shift was not dramatic, but the tightening around his eyes was unmistakable. "Inside a storage room?" he asked quietly. Yes, sir. The officer continued carefully. The door had been locked from the outside. For a brief moment the room fell completely silent. William did not speak immediately. His gaze moved across the table, absorbing the meaning of the words before responding. She was locked inside. His voice remained controlled, but the disbelief beneath it was clear. The officer nodded once. She was discovered within minutes by the patrol guard assigned to that corridor. He forced the latch and removed her safely. William exhaled slowly through his nose, his eyes briefly lowering toward the table. When he spoke again, his tone was sharper, though still disciplined. How does a child end up locked in a service room inside a protected residence? No one answered immediately. The officer understood that the question was not rhetorical. It demanded an explanation. "We are still reviewing the circumstances," he said. "However, initial system analysis indicates that a surveillance camera covering the corridor lost signal for 6 minutes shortly before the discovery." William looked up immediately. "Lost signal?" "Yes, sir." The officer slid a printed report across the table. "The interruption appears to have been deliberate." The implication hung heavily in the room. A deliberate camera disruption inside a royal residence was not a technical glitch. It suggested intent. William's calm demeanor remained intact, but the anger beneath it had become visible now in the stillness of his posture. "So someone interfered with palace security systems," he said slowly. "During the same 6 minutes my daughter was locked in a dark room." No one in the room attempted to soften the reality of that statement. The officer answered directly. "That is the current working assessment." William stepped away from the window and walked slowly toward the table. Each movement was controlled, but the tension surrounding him was unmistakable. He rested both hands on the edge of the table and leaned forward slightly. "Tell me exactly how she was found." The officer turned a page in the report. The patrol guard noticed that the storage door was locked externally. That violates residential safety protocol, so he forced it open. Princess Charlotte was inside. William's jaw tightened briefly. And if he hadn't noticed? The officer did not answer immediately, because both men in the room understood the question did not need a response. The briefing continued with the same careful precision, but the emotional weight in the room had shifted. William remained standing beside the table, listening intently as the officer moved through the next part of the report. Following the discovery, the guard escorted Princess Charlotte back to the residential wing and reported the breach through the command channel. At that time, investigators began reviewing surveillance logs. William nodded once. "And the person responsible?" The officer hesitated briefly before answering. "Not yet identified." The prince's gaze sharpened. "But you believe someone inside the palace was involved?" "Yes, sir." The officer turned to another document. During the 6-minute camera interruption, an access card was detected within the corridor system. However, no staff were scheduled to be working in that area. William absorbed the information without speaking. The idea that someone with legitimate internal credentials might have used them improperly inside the palace was clearly unacceptable. "What about the guard who found her?" he asked after a moment. The officer looked down at the final section of the report. His attention to detail prevented the situation from lasting longer. He noticed irregularities others might have overlooked. William's expression softened slightly, not with relief, but with recognition. "Explain." The officer continued. "After reporting the incident, the guard observed something investigators initially missed. The access card signal appeared closer to a secondary maintenance door rather than the storage corridor itself." William raised an eyebrow slightly. "Meaning?" "Meaning the individual responsible may have moved through a hidden service passage connected to the corridor." William straightened slowly. And the guard realized this? Yes, sir. The officer closed the folder. He left his assigned checkpoint briefly to verify the maintenance door location. That decision led investigators to a passage that had been recently used. William remained silent for several seconds. The information had shifted the entire tone of the situation. What initially appeared to be a simple mistake now looked like deliberate misuse of internal access privileges. So this guard, William said quietly, noticed the locked door, rescued my daughter, and then identified the escape route the intruder used. The officer nodded once. Correct, sir. William walked slowly around the table, his thoughts clearly moving beyond the initial shock of the incident. His anger had not disappeared, but it had redirected itself. I want a full internal investigation, he said firmly. Every access log, every maintenance credential, every surveillance interruption. Already underway, sir. William stopped near the doorway and looked back at the officer. And the guard? The officer hesitated briefly before answering. Technically, leaving the checkpoint without authorization could trigger a procedural review. William's expression hardened slightly at that suggestion. That guard used his judgment to find something your systems missed. The officer did not disagree. William spoke again, quieter this time, but with unmistakable conviction. If he had ignored that instinct, we might still be looking for answers instead of evidence. The room fell silent once more. After a moment, William nodded toward the folder. Continue the investigation. Then he added, almost as an afterthought, and make sure the guard knows I'm aware of what he did. The officer acknowledged the instruction with a respectful nod, because within palace protection, quiet recognition from the family being protected carried more weight than any formal announcement.
3 days after the incident, the palace had returned to its familiar rhythm. Corridors that had briefly filled with investigators and security technicians now carried only the usual quiet movement of staff and patrols. On the surface, nothing appeared different. The residential wing remained calm, ceremonial routines continued, and the public outside the palace walls remained unaware that a serious security breach had occurred inside the protected residence. Yet within the internal security network, the investigation had moved steadily forward. Access records, maintenance credentials, and internal system logs had been examined with careful precision. The results revealed something less dramatic than an outside intruder, but no less concerning. During a restricted maintenance check scheduled earlier that week, a staff technician had used a valid access card to enter the service corridor network. The work had been legitimate, but the procedures around it had not been followed correctly. A camera panel had been temporarily disconnected while the technician inspected a wiring junction. The system had automatically restored the signal after 6 minutes, exactly as the logs recorded. During that same window, a second individual with limited service access had entered the corridor, believing it to be temporarily inactive due to the maintenance work. That person had noticed the storage door slightly open and shut it quickly without realizing a child had wandered inside moments earlier. The latch had been turned automatically as the door closed. What appeared at first to be a deliberate act had instead been the result of overlapping errors, a maintenance interruption, poor communication between staff schedules, and a careless decision made in a moment of assumption. The investigation concluded that the situation had not been malicious, but the consequences of the mistakes had been serious enough to trigger a complete revision of internal procedures. The royal guard who had discovered the problem learned these details only in fragments during the following days. Guards were rarely briefed on the full conclusions of internal investigations unless their testimony was required.
His role in the event had already been documented, and his patrol duties continued as usual. That afternoon, however, he received an unexpected message through the command channel. Residential Patrol 3, report to the private conference room at 1400 hours. The instruction was brief and carried no explanation. At the appointed time, the guard walked through the quiet corridor leading toward the smaller administrative rooms near the residential wing. His posture remained exactly as it always was during duty, straight-backed, composed, professional. When he reached the conference room door, he knocked once. A voice from inside answered, "Enter." The room was smaller than the large briefing space used during the investigation. Only 3 people were present: the senior protection officer, another security supervisor, and a palace administrative aide standing near the far side of the table. The guard stepped inside and stopped at the appropriate distance from the table. "Sir." The senior officer returned the nod. "At ease." The guard relaxed slightly, but remained standing. The officer opened a thin folder resting on the table. "The investigation into the service corridor incident has concluded." The guard said nothing, waiting for the officer to continue. "Security systems confirm that no malicious intrusion occurred," the officer explained. "However, the situation revealed several procedural weaknesses." He paused briefly before adding the next sentence. "More importantly, it demonstrated the value of careful observation during routine patrol." The officer closed the folder and looked directly at the guard. "You noticed irregularities that others did not." The room remained quiet as the senior officer continued speaking. "You observed the locked door. You responded immediately and ensured the safety of the child inside. Afterward, you identified an access point investigators had not yet examined." The guard listened without changing expression. In palace service, recognition was never dramatic. Achievements were acknowledged with the same calm professionalism as routine duty. The officer stepped around the table and approached him with a small case in his hand. "In palace protection," he said, "routine is necessary, but routine can also dull attention if a guard becomes too comfortable with familiar surroundings." He paused, then added quietly, "You did not allow that to happen." The officer opened the case. Inside rested a small commendation insignia issued internally within the Royal Protection Service. It was not a public decoration and would never appear in any ceremony outside the palace walls. Most guards who received it did so quietly, often years into their service. The officer handed the insignia to the guard. "This is a private commendation for vigilance during protective duty." The guard accepted it with a brief nod. "Thank you, sir." The exchange lasted only a few seconds. No applause followed. No formal announcement would be made. That was the nature of palace security. Important actions were often recognized in the same quiet manner in which they were performed. The administrative aide then stepped forward with a short written note. "There is one additional message from His Royal Highness." The guard accepted the folded paper. He did not open it immediately. Reading personal messages during formal briefings was not customary. The aide offered a small nod, indicating that he could read it now. The guard unfolded the paper carefully. The message was brief, written in a steady hand. It contained only a few sentences thanking him for his attention to detail and acknowledging that his decision to investigate the irregularities had ensured Princess Charlotte's safety. The wording was formal, but the meaning behind it was unmistakably personal. The guard folded the note again and placed it carefully inside the inner pocket of his uniform. The senior officer closed the meeting with a final remark. "Your patrol schedule resumes as normal." The guard nodded once more. "Understood, sir." A moment later, he stepped back into the corridor outside the conference room. The palace halls looked exactly as they always had, quiet, orderly, and controlled. Staff moved through the distant intersections, and another patrol guard passed by with a brief nod of acknowledgement. The guard returned the gesture and continued down the corridor toward his assigned post. The commendation case remained secure in his pocket, but it changed nothing about his duties. In Royal Protection Service, recognition was never the purpose of vigilance. The purpose was the responsibility itself. Corridors had to be watched, doors had to be noticed, small irregularities had to be questioned. Because inside a palace, the difference between routine and danger was often nothing more than a single detail, something as small as a door that should never have been locked.